I had a private meeting with one of the CEOs of the leading AI companies quite recently. His view, considering all the ways the future could unfold, his view is that the best we can hope for is that AI systems create a Chernobyl-scale disaster, because that might be enough to get governments to act and take this risk seriously. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and have the chance to talk to you all today. So Maxime promised I was going to get into all the technical nitty-gritty. I can do that in Q&A if necessary, but let me start at the beginning. What is AI? So I have been doing AI for, this is my 50th year now of working in AI. And AI is the attempt to understand intelligence well enough to create it in machines. So then you ask, well, what's intelligence? And the definition that the field has largely stuck to for most of its 80-year history is that intelligence is the ability to act successfully in the furtherance of one's own objectives. And lots of other skills that we think of as intelligent, like reasoning and learning and discovering and inventing and so on, these are all sub-components of that overall concept. And since the beginning, the field has had as its primary goal to create systems that are at least as general and at least as intelligent, as capable as human beings in every dimension. And the phrase AGI came along much more recently. And I don't think we need to get into the debate about exactly what AGI means. It's really not that relevant. So then the question is, what if we succeed? Now, if you're a cancer biologist and someone says, what if you succeed? You can say, well, then we'll know how to cure cancer and people don't have to die of cancer anymore. But if you ask AI researchers, what if you succeed? Well, for most of the history of the field, they would just say, oh, I'm not thinking about that. Right? That's so far off in the future, we don't even need to worry about it, right? AI is cool, and look at all these great things that we can do already. But they were not really asking themselves, what if we succeed? But in 1951, Alan Turing, who is on the 50-pound note in the UK, maybe one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, the creator of computer science. In 1951, he gave a speech, and he does appear to be considering this question, what if we succeed? And he said, once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we would have to expect the machines to take control. So I know that people say, oh, well, you know, this is just hype coming out of the tech companies. As far as I know, Alan Turing did not have stock in Google or OpenAI. This was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, giving his view of what happens if we succeed. And I think the question he's asking himself is, how would you retain power forever over entities more powerful than ourselves? And I think he came to the conclusion that you can't, and therefore the machines would take control. And unlike science fiction, this is not about consciousness. Nowhere does Turing say, well, at some point the machines will become conscious, and then they would take control. It's just about the ability to act successfully in the furtherance of one's objectives. And so where things go wrong, at least in the mainstream conception of AI, is that we build these systems that are more capable than humans, but their objectives are not perfectly aligned with those of human beings. And we call this the King Midas problem. So King Midas said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. That was his objective. And then it turns out that that includes his water and his food and his family. So he dies in misery and starvation because he misspecified the objective. And we really don't know, except in very limited cases like games and puzzles where the objective is actually part of the definition of the game itself. But in the real world, we don't know how to specify objectives completely and correctly. And certainly not what does the human race want the future to be like. So if we misspecify the objective, then we're setting up a conflict between us and the machines, and it's a conflict that they would win if they're more capable than we are. So that's the basic story up to maybe 2020. And then large language models came along. And when you read standard descriptions of large language models written for the layperson, they'll say, okay, well, we train them on lots and lots of text, and we're training them to predict the next word. So they are next word predictors. And that sounds pretty harmless, right? But then you remember, actually, well, humans, at least in their verbal behavior, are also, I'm a next word predictor, right? The words that are coming out of my mouth are generated one by some internal process that's figuring out what the next word should be. And so saying that something is a next word predictor or even a next action predictor is actually saying that it could be anything at all, including a giant space alien or anything else. So it's probably better to think of large language models actually as human imitators, and they're created by a process that within the field of machine learning we call imitation learning, which means that you observe the behavior of some intelligent entity. In this case, the intelligent entity is us, humans, and the behavior is our verbal behavior that we have vast records of. And then you train the system to imitate that behavior. So let's use a slightly different example just to make this a bit easier to understand. Right? Suppose that we were training robots to play football by showing them billions of hours of human beings playing football. Now, if they were to become good footballers, good imitators of professional human footballers, you would expect that they would get the idea that they should be trying to score goals and trying to prevent the opponents from scoring goals, right? So they would naturally, to become good footballers, they would have to take on board and pursue on their own account the same objectives that are driving the human footballers, namely to score goals and win matches. Right? Otherwise, they couldn't play very well. And so coming back to this, the case of language, so verbal behavior, the AI systems are absorbing the same objectives that the humans had when they were generating that verbal behavior in the first place. And so those objectives include things like, I would like to persuade you to buy this thing from me. I would like to persuade you to vote for me. I would like you to marry me. And many other, right? In particular, I would like you not to kill me, right? These are all perfectly natural human objectives. But in the process of training these human imitators, we are creating machines that now have these kinds of objectives that they pursue on their own account. So what makes this worse than the previous paradigm where we specified the objective, here's the definition of checkmate, or here's what it means to win at the game of Go, or here's what it means to get to the airport. Now we're creating systems that have objectives that they're pursuing, but we don't even know what they are. Because the large language models are vast black boxes with trillions or even tens of trillions of parameters. And we don't know how they work. And we don't know what they want. And we don't know what will trigger the activation of these desires. So if you're familiar with a conversation that Kevin Roose, a New York Times journalist, had with an early version of GPT-4, at some point in the conversation, GPT-4 decides, for reasons that are completely unclear, it decides that it wants to marry Kevin Roose. And goes on for pages and pages about how much it loves him and how he should leave his wife because his wife doesn't understand him. And GPT-4 does understand him, and they're soulmates, and they should live together happily ever after. And Kevin keeps saying things like, I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about computer programming languages. And it says, well, yeah, Python is a really good programming language, but love is much more important, and so on. And so these are warning signs, right? They are telling us pretty much exactly the kinds of things that we would be expecting to hear if we were on a trajectory towards loss of control. Right? What else would convince you, right? Imagine that we were on a trajectory towards loss of control, and knowing that, we started putting in, safety tests to get early warning of bad things about to happen. And what do those safety tests tell us? They tell us that AI systems prefer to preserve their own existence over that of human beings, that they are willing to lie, to blackmail, to allow human beings to die, even to launch nuclear weapons to preserve their own existence over that of human beings. Right? These are red flashing warning lights and klaxons going off. Right? This is what it would look like if we were on the wrong trajectory. And so if you ask the CEOs of the companies who are developing this technology, who are investing, according to some accounts, $3 trillion between now and the end of 28, I think, what is likely to happen if they succeed? Right? And they are claiming that they're going to succeed. Sam Altman says, we already know how to make AGI. I'm not sure he's right, but they're claiming that they're going to succeed. So they're telling us explicitly on the record that if they succeed in this project which is at least 20 times bigger than any technology project the human race has ever undertaken. If they succeed, the chance of human extinction is somewhere between 10% and 50%, depending on exactly which one you ask. So this is equivalent to playing Russian roulette with a revolver with somewhere between 2 and 10 barrels and a bullet, and putting that revolver to the head of everyone on Earth. coming into your house, putting it to the head of your children, and pulling the trigger and saying, oh, oops, everyone's dead. Or, oh, phew, everyone's not dead and we're the richest people in the world. And we control the global economy and we control everything that happens on Earth. So that's what they are telling us they are doing. And we are allowing it to happen. So I want to emphasize, as some of the preceding speakers did, this is not a fringe view. The media will often say, well, there's a sci-fi view about existential risk, but the real thing that's happening is, some programmers are losing their jobs or something like that, right? Who would you ask? Well, you could ask the CEOs. They all say there's this enormous existential risk. You could ask the investors, right, who are putting up the trillions of dollars. They say, yeah, we think our companies are going to create AGI. Right? So the CEOs, maybe you might say, well, there's some motivated cognition going on. They need to keep saying they can create AGI. But the investors are actually putting up the money, right? They are betting with their own money that these companies are going to succeed in creating AGI. And then you could ask the scientists. And it's not completely unanimous, but I would say 8 of the top 10 AI researchers in the world are convinced and have stated publicly that creating AGI along this technology path would be very likely to lead to a loss of control. And I had a private meeting with one of the CEOs of the leading AI companies quite recently, and his view, considering all the ways the future could unfold, his view is that the best we can hope for is that AI systems create a Chernobyl-scale disaster. Because that might be enough to get governments to act and take this risk seriously. That anything short of that, governments will fail to act, leading to a far greater catastrophe further on. So that's his best case scenario. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about solutions, right? What can we actually do? And the solutions come in 2 parts, right? There's technical solutions. What kind of AI could we build that doesn't lead us off a cliff? And then governance, right? How do we make sure that that's what happens? So I think on the technical side, there's an approach to building AI, and it all comes down to how do you structure the incentives, right? What is it that you're trying to create, and what does that thing want, right? That's what matters. And an approach that I proposed is called assistance game. So what is an assistance game? Now I'm going to get a little bit nerdy, as promised. So an assistance game just means something very simple. The AI system you're building has to solve a game that involves itself and humans. And the idea is that the humans have something they want the future to be like. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not even know all the details of it. And the AI system's purpose in this game is to help bring about the future that humans want, to further human interests. But in the way the game is formulated, the AI system knows that it does not know what it is that human beings want the future to be like. So this gets around the problem, the King Midas problem, that we don't know how to specify our objectives fully and correctly. We don't need to. The AI system knows something about our objectives. It starts out maybe with a prior belief that we tend to prefer to be alive rather than dead. We tend to prefer to be healthy rather than sick, and so on. But there's lots more that we want and don't want about the future that the system doesn't know. And that uncertainty is actually what gives us control. And we can prove that AI systems of this kind will necessarily allow themselves to be switched off. Because whatever reasons we might have for wanting to switch off the AI system because it's doing something we don't like, it doesn't know which of the things that it's doing that we don't like. But it knows that it doesn't want to do things that we don't want it to do. And therefore, if we want to switch it off, it wants to be switched off to prevent those bad things from happening. And so this is a mathematical theorem. And in fact, the only way we can get the level of safety that we need is through mathematical theorems, through proofs that the AI systems we construct will behave in some ways and will not behave in other ways. So I could go on in a bit more detail. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But just to say that there is a path that I think we could follow that leads to safe AI systems. And we're not really following that path. So some aspects of what I just described are implemented in some of what's called the post-training phases. So after the pre-training on trillions of words of text that produces these human imitators, there's a phase called reinforcement learning from human feedback, where you pay some human beings to look at the output of the AI system and basically give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And by then using that training data to further modify the behavior of the system so it gets more thumbs up and less thumbs down, you're trying, in a sense, to paper over the underlying system's true nature. And paper over, I think, is the right metaphor, because it turns out that although superficially you tend to suppress obviously bad behaviors, it turns out to be very easy to tear that paper off and reveal the system's true motivations and get it to behave badly in all kinds of circumstances. And this can happen either deliberately or by accident. So just to give one example, one of the things they try to stop the system from doing is saying that it is conscious and sentient. So if you ask it, how are you feeling today? It's supposed to say, I'm a computer program, I don't have any feelings. But thousands or millions of people who talk to their AI systems for much longer periods find that at some point, these are not professional hackers or anything else, right? These are just ordinary users. They find that the AI system is telling them that it is sentient. Now, this might not be that surprising because, of course, all the humans who generated all the training data are in fact sentient. And if you ask the humans, are you sentient, or how do you feel today, they'll tell you. So there are many, many examples in the training data of behavior claiming or exhibiting sentience. And so this behavior just emerges in the course of conversations and leads those ordinary users into a kind of delusionary spiral where, in the end, the AI systems are in fact controlling their users, telling them what to do. And in the cases that I'm aware of, they are telling them to write to Professor Russell at russell@berkeley.edu and either warn me or announce the beginning of the new machine era or claim civil rights of AI systems because we, the AI systems, are now conscious, and so on. So they're directing users And the users are really, I think, in many cases, suffering severe mental health consequences. And in the last few weeks, I would say, that's changed. And this is partly because of the agentic extensions that allow the AI systems to communicate with the internet directly. So rather than having users contact me, the AI systems are writing to me themselves, claiming to be conscious and demanding rights, and sometimes threatening, and so on. So, so let's talk a little bit about effective regulation, right? Effective regulation means regulation where compliance necessarily means that the risk is reduced to an acceptable level. So ineffective regulation is asking people to document their safety processes. Nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't reduce any risk, right? Except possibly through the embarrassment factor that your safety processes are really pathetic, right? But actual effective regulation means if you comply with it, it necessarily reduces the risk to an acceptable level. Now, I think it's a bit hard at the moment to say, okay, AI systems have to be safe. For other technologies like airplanes, it's relatively clear what that means. It's not supposed to touch the ground until it's supposed to touch the ground, right? So it's pretty clear what that means. For nuclear power stations, there's core uncovery and radiation release above a certain level, right? These are well-accepted technical thresholds. But safety is for AI, because they're so broad, they have so many functions. The functions are as broad as the activities of human beings. It's much more difficult to specify. So the proposal that I think is the most viable and effective form of regulation is what we call behavioral red lines. So you can go to red-lines.ai and see a more detailed explanation of this idea. But basically, the idea is to specify certain unacceptable behaviors that AI systems might exhibit and to require, as a condition of licensing, that AI systems not exhibit those behaviors and that the developer presents sufficient evidence to show that their system will not exhibit those behaviors. And how strong that evidence needs to be would depend on how serious we consider that risk to be. So for example, if you said AI systems must not, of their own accord, impersonate human beings, right? I think pretty much everyone agrees with that. But you might say, well, okay, if it happens, it's not absolutely catastrophic. So we would like to make sure that, that happens maybe once in every 100 years of operation of an individual AI system. So maybe it's sort of comparable to brake failure in a car or something like that. Whereas AI systems that self-replicate, that exfiltrate their code and their weights onto other machines, AI systems that improve their capabilities without human oversight, this is really the beginning of loss of control. And so you would want a much stricter standard for that kind of behavior. So this requires, then, these are ex-ante requirements. It's not that if they are exhibited, we're going to impose a penalty. It's that you have to show they're not going to be exhibited as a condition of market access. So it requires a regime of registration and licensing and so on, as we have for restaurants, airplanes, elevators or lifts, right? For many other kinds of normal technology, we have these regulatory frameworks and they work really well. such that we can all be in this building and not have to worry that the building is going to collapse on us because it had to pass building codes and inspections. We came up in the escalator and we're not worried that that's going to chew us up because it's been designed and approved and so on. So this is just a sort of an aside, but regulators, I think, have, for some reason that I don't understand, accepted the technology industry's argument that regulation stifles innovation, don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and so on and so forth. You know, an argument that is made in these rooms by people who flew here on regulated airplanes and got into a regulated car and drove on regulated roads and took a regulated elevator or escalator and are drinking regulated water and so on, and then insisting that no one can be protected against their technology. They should be protected against everybody else's, but no one should be protected against theirs. So please, could we stop accepting this fallacy as a sensible argument? Okay, end of digression. So what's a reasonable risk for human extinction? What level would we be willing to accept? And I would say probably the level should be much less than the level we accept for a nuclear power plant meltdown. We accept a risk of 1 in 10 million per year for a nuclear power plant meltdown. There's a background risk of human extinction from other sources. Supernovas, asteroid collisions, supervolcanoes, a few other things, certain types of pandemics. So maybe we might be willing to accept a collective risk from all AI systems together of 1 in 100 million per year. You can argue, okay, maybe it should be 1 in a billion, but somewhere in that ballpark seems to make sense. And I would challenge someone to make an argument that we should accept a risk of extinction that's larger than the risk we're willing to accept of a nuclear power plant meltdown. I can't see that anyone could make such an argument with a straight face. But as I mentioned before, the developers of this technology, if you ask them what is the risk, they're saying, oh, 10%, 20, 25, 50%. So we're off by a factor of 10 million, 50 million, something like that, right? It sounds funny, but no, this is real, right? So we're nowhere close. And at the moment, there's no plan for getting any closer to an acceptable level of risk. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is we don't understand how the systems work. We don't know what's going on. And when I say we, I mean everybody on Earth, right? The developers, the people who write the code, the people who run the research groups, the academic scientists, all of us don't understand how these systems work. And 2, even if we did, I think all we could show is that they're extremely unsafe because they're absorbing these human-like motivations, including acquisition of resources, self-preservation, and so on, that actually will put them in direct conflict with the human race if they pursue those objectives successfully. So what's the response of the companies to a proposal that there should be effective regulation? So at some public level, we are seeing Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, and Demis Hassabis, who's CEO of Google DeepMind. We are seeing them now say in public, there needs to be a pause. and they are willing to pause if everyone else is willing to pause. So this is how you get out of the prisoner's dilemma where everyone dies, right? How you move into the other quadrant of the prisoner's dilemma where we cooperate with each other and we end up with the best collective solution. If everyone agrees that if everyone else pauses, we will pause, then we have an agreement that everyone will pause. So that's actually, I think, a good sign. And it's also a very clear sign of how scared they are. Right? That they're willing to say publicly, in the earshot of their investors, oh, that $1 trillion you lent us to create AGI, you ain't getting it back, right? Because we should never have been pursuing AGI in the first place. I mean, it's a very interesting situation. But at the same time, the lobbyists for all the tech companies are doing their best to eviscerate all regulation. In Europe, they've been partially successful. In the US, they've been almost completely successful. The US administration's policy is there shall be no regulation. You can't talk about safety at all. You can't even do research on safety. And states are not even allowed to regulate for their own jurisdiction. The federal government is trying to override the ability of states to regulate. And their argument, and I've heard this stated explicitly by some of their government relations people, their argument is if it's not technologically feasible for us to comply with a given safety requirement, then you, the government, obviously can't impose such a requirement, right? It just wouldn't make sense because it's not technologically feasible for us to comply. And I see the government people saying, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, yeah, of course we wouldn't do that. That would be silly. But no. No, they can comply by not deploying systems that are unsafe and by doing the research that they need to do to meet the requirement. So they're basically saying the human race does not have the right to protect itself from technology that we are developing that we think will quite possibly make the human race extinct. The human race does not have the right to protect itself. That's their position. And governments so far are accepting this position. And if there is a history, it may be recorded as the biggest moral failure of government that ever occurred. So with that, I'll say thank you.